It seems like just yesterday to me that we were delivering the first Freethought Backbone Award in 2004 to Michael Newdow in Washington, D.C. We have since given the award to the candidate without a prayer and Secular Coalition for America President Herb Silverman, to the Institute for Humanist Studies founder Larry Jones, to the first Harvard Humanist chaplain Tom Farrick, to the Secular Coalition for America director Lori Lippman Brown, and last year to the Freedom from Religion Foundation co-director Dan Barker. The Backbone Award is presented for exceptional and enduring commitment to our movement. It's a way for the students of this movement to recognize people who've led the kinds of lives that we one day hope to lead. I know that we're all eager to hear this evening's award recipient soon, Ellery Schempp, but indulge me for a few moments as I give you just a few of the accomplishments of one of my heroes. Ellery was raised in the Philadelphia suburb of Abington, and in 1958 he graduated from Abington Senior High School, where just a few years earlier, Ellery had protested his compulsory participation in school Bible readings. This was required by Pennsylvania law at the time, and specifically the statute required that at least 10 verses of the Holy Bible, doesn't say which Holy Bible, that's interesting, be read without comment at the opening of each public school day at each public school on each public school day. Ellery argued that this violated his and his family's First and 14th Amendment rights. Abington v. Schempp would eventually have the allegedly more famous Murray versus Curlett decision or case combined with it before it was heard before the U.S. Supreme Court and eventually decided 8-1 in Schempp's favor in 1963. If you think being an out activist for church-state separation is a tough row to hoe right now, you should try it back in the late 50s. And it's important to realize that this took so long that if it weren't for the case that Ellery had younger siblings, that he and his family would have lost standing by the time this actually got in front of the Supreme Court. So these little things end up making a big difference. And this was a big difference and a big accomplishment, and it changed the character of church-state separation in the United States ever since. And this accomplishment alone would have been enough to nail Ellery's name in the pages of Freethought history. But for Ellery, this was actually just the start. He went on to get his Ph.D. from Brown University in physics, and he went on throughout his career to co-author and author 33 papers that were published in peer-reviewed journals, and played a significant role in the invention of magnetic resonance imaging. In 2002, he was inducted into the Abington Senior High School Hall of Fame. Guess why? Not because of the church-state issue. Because of his very impressive scientific accomplishments. And this, fortunately, I understand, has led to something of a peacemaking between his family and Abington Senior High School. So I'm glad that happened. But when it comes to giving Ellery awards, the Secular Student Alliance is actually kind of late to the game. Ellery has already received awards from the American Civil Liberties Union, from Americans United for Separation of Church and State, from the American Humanist Association, and from the Unitarian Universalist Association. Nonetheless, when our board of directors was discussing who to give the 2010 Freethought Backbone Award to, and Ellery's name came up, the decision was made. It was suddenly obvious that Ellery was the perfect person on so many levels to give this award to. We knew that we had to give it to Ellery. So it is with profound humility and honor that I present the 2010 Secular Student Alliance Freethought Backbone Award to you, Dr. Ellery Schempp.
Thank you very much, Elvis.
Junk out of your way.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's an extremely great pleasure to be here, and thank you for that very nice introduction. You didn't happen to mention that I was born in 1940, and just once. My mother was actually there, and she had no intention of having me born again. But I am a member of a church. And so now maybe I should say, let us pray. I was waiting for nervous giggles. Isn't it amazing how that phrase evokes memories and reactions? Well, I pray for continued respect for separation of church and state. And I'm very happy to be here with secular students, and I really do regret that I'm no longer a student. Or maybe I am, because I learn new things every day. Sometime in my early life, I resolved to learn one new thing every day. Simple things. What is the name of that tree or that flower? What's the population of Boston? What's the half-life of carbon-14? And I learned from many people, and I came to know, I learned from the many people I came to know, and people who themselves knew about things and thought about things. And I learned from doing things, like fixing windows and plumbing, and from making mistakes. And I found this was a lot of fun. You know, I did a few things on my own steam, but mostly what I did was with the help of others. So I accept this award for my parents, for the American Civil Liberties Union, for our attorney, Henry Sawyer, and for our institutions, for the teachers, the professors, the bosses, and the friends who helped and guided me. This is not merely to come here to appear humble. Indeed, I'm the only person you're likely to know who's been within 400 miles of the North Pole and to within 800 miles of the South Pole, and who made a protest that resulted in a Supreme Court case that changed the practices in the public schools across the whole of the United States, more or less once and for all. Now, because of my adventuring in the mountains and the Himalayas and the Alps and many other places, and being in Antarctica, I cannot resist recalling the heroic words of Sir Robert Falcon Scott, who perished in March of 1911 on his return from the South Pole, being very greatly disappointed that the Norwegian Amundsen had actually beat him there. In the end, he kept a marvelous diary, and in the end, knowing that the end was coming, he wrote these words: "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, courage, and endurance of my companions that would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. But these rough notes and our dead bodies must tell that tale." Now, I only recite that for purely dramatic effect, but I can do it because I've been there. I am humbled by the fact that so many societal institutions were available to give me opportunities. You know, in high school, in Abington, and in college at Tufts, most people would have described me as a loner. In school, when choosing upsides in gym class, I was always the last one picked. And I think many secular students feel alone. I mean, it is not easy to be an anti-God, anti-Allah, anti-Shiva, anti-Christian, anti-Islamic, atheist, secularist, humanist, skeptic, heathen, heretic, and pagan. In fact, it can get quite confusing. But fear not, I am all these in varying measures. I'm also an agnostic. Agnostics are those who think seeking ultimate truth or asking about God is equivalent to asking, what color is Tuesday? Many of you have left or escaped from some traditional religious upbringing or have parents who disapprove of non-belief. There are many paths to secular humanism, but this can make any of us feel alone, and that is why SSA is so important. We share ideas and laugh together and find like-minded friends. Well, most of you already know my story. For 200 years or so, it was common practice in most schools to have some sort of Bible reading and prayer in the morning. These morning devotions arose out of our history. After all, the idea of universal education was a relatively new idea that took firm root in the era of the Enlightenment, around the time of 1776 and 1820. The idea that being educated, that is, being able to read and write, having some knowledge about nature, knowing something about the wider world outside one's own village, this was a radical idea when applied to the common man. Well, way back in 1956, when I was 16 years old, and you know, that was about the time the Egyptian pyramids were being built, I thought about this Bible reading and prayer stuff. And for those of you interested in the legal details, and the relationship of the famous atheist Madeleine Murray, I encourage you to read this book by Stephen Solomon, who's a professor of journalism at New York University. It's really very well written, and I don't get a nickel from it, and I didn't choose the title. But it's about $12 nowadays on Amazon. It's a humbling thing to have a book written about what I did when I was 16 years old. Why do we believe what we believe? Well, we all have beliefs, even when we don't consciously recognize them. Our brains are wired in such a way that we need to believe in things. I have another talk about why we believe and what we disbelieve. And this is something you should all think about as we learn more and more about how our brains work. A lot of religious groups believe in holy water. How do you make holy water? It's simple. You take ordinary tap water and just boil the hell out of it. This is from a scientific perspective, of course. But we should be careful about what words we use. I don't believe in the theory of evolution. I think that evolution is the most coherent, evidence-based understanding of our origins and existence. I think that the idea of a God is unnecessary. All the things that I have seen and known in my life have understandings within the natural world. This includes my emotions about being in love, about loving music, about enjoying art and science, about wondering where I fit in with the scheme of things, about death, about caring for others, about having a partner in life. So I would like to address a subject dear to my heart. It's about the separation of church and state. You might encounter some people who argue about this. But let me tell you, there is nothing in the Constitution about the Bible, and there is nothing in the Bible about democracy or our Constitution. Our Constitution never once mentions God or Christianity or any commandments. It is a purely humanistic document. The preamble begins, "We the people do ordain and establish." Our Constitution mentions religion just twice, and both times the word "no" is attached. The first mention is in Article 6. No religious test shall ever be required. The second time, of course, is in the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Constitution is a religiously neutral, secular, and political document. No founding father thought the idea of an independent judiciary or three branches of government came from divine revelation. And by contrast, the Bible never once mentions democracy, a republic, or anything related to American values. The Bible never once mentions freedom of speech or freedom of religion. The Bible provides no model for good government or for personal freedoms. It is a purely religious and theological document. So it seems to me that Bible reading and prayer in the schools do not promote American civic values or patriotic values at all. I might mention, incidentally, that the Bible never once mentions the Trinity either, or Satan, or the phrase original sin. 1956. That's ancient history for most of you. This was 2 years after the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation was intrinsically unequal. A few years after the McCarthy era, when every dissent was labeled communist and treason. We used to have a committee in the House of Representatives, HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, and it caused enormous pain and problems in the United States. 1956, about a year after Playboy started publishing. 2 years after Congress added the phrase "under God" to the pledge. I was lucky to grow up in a family that knew about the ACLU and were members of a Unitarian church. We were a quite ordinary family living in the suburbs, except for this. Why did I object? First of all, it was just silly. In the younger grades, the teacher would read the Bible, of course. By junior high, teachers turned it over to the pupils to do it in turn. Hardly anyone remembered when it was their turn. All you had to do was open the Bible at random, stumble through 10 verses, and you were done. And anyone who has seen a class of second or third graders, you know, you can get them to pray or to pledge. That is, they stand up, they mumble, they sit down, they done their duty. Bible reading and prayer were supposed to fill us with some inspiration for the tasks ahead that day, according to the lawyers for the school board. Indeed, I do recall some inspiration. On my next turn to read, I chose verses from the Song of Solomon. Thy breaths are like two doves in the morning dew. This was pretty heady stuff for 14-year-olds, at least in 1954, especially when sanctioned by the school. Then came King Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines. At the time, I aspired only to having a single girlfriend, so this was distinctly inspiring. But I felt that there was a fundamental issue of fairness for all. My Jewish school friends were clearly uncomfortable with Christmas and Easter passages in the Bible. Jews, of course, do not consider the New Testament the Word of God, and there are certainly passages there that have been hurtful to Jews over the centuries. The Bible is not the holy book of Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, or Hindus. Non-believers, pagans, humanists, and others do not need Christianity preached to them in the schools. If freedom of religious conscience is good for some, it is good for all. That is equality and fairness. Nor do I consider the Bible a valuable source of truth, certainly no more than any other book written 2,000 years ago. It is ridiculous to imagine that Bronze Age herders with kings from a bloodline of Cohens could have moral insights that are relevant today. And while there are some beautiful verses, there are also many quite ugly sections. There are many stories in the Bible and Leviticus and Deuteronomy that demonstrate clearly that the Bible is a book unfit for children. It is full of rapes, incest, mindless slaughter, animal torture, sacrifices, and even genocide. Unfit for children and for all of modern civilization. And the notion of reading about Noah's flood under the imprimatur and authority of a state-sponsored devotion and then going to geology or biology class was and is deeply offensive to my scientific sensibilities. We all know that Noah's flood never happened. I do not believe in miracles or supernatural interventions in human affairs, and I thought it was wrong for the schools to teach them. I disbelieve in talking snakes, too. Or at least I used to, but then Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin came along. In traveling around the country and listening to the radio, I'm amazed by how many Bible preachers there are, milking the believers. It is a disturbing fact. There are about 66,000 school districts in the U.S., and about 90,000 preachers, priests, pastors, and ministers. The Bible is not the inspired work of God, or at least he inspired a whole lot of different versions. Most people don't know that the Catholic version, the Douay Rheims, is quite different from the Protestant versions. In text, it's different. It differs in text and the numbering of books and the titling of books and the numbering of the Ten Commandments, and it certainly differs in interpretations. Everything is interpreted by quite mortal men who have beliefs and agendas. There's a whole body of stuff, I hesitate to call it an intellectual endeavor, called Christian apologetics. This is an endless massaging and masturbation of biblical passages to twist some meaning out of it that is supposed to be truth. I think apologetics is the greatest waste of human brain power since the invention of language. Of course, in school, no power on earth or heaven can prevent a student from offering up a silent prayer before taking an algebra exam. However, I always urge that doing the homework and studying is far better preparation than prayer. That's the ex-professor in me. In 1963, a year after I graduated from Tufts, the Supreme Court decided the case called Abington versus Schempp and Murray versus Curlett. The justices, as August said, decided 8-1 that Bible reading and public prayer rituals in the schools were unconstitutional under the First Amendment. The Schempp-Murray case was just one part of a continuum. There were many prior families who paved the way: Everson, McCullum, Torcaso, Engel, particularly Engel versus Vitale in 1962, where the court ruled the New York Board of Regents prayer was unconstitutional. The memorable phrase from that decision is, "It is no part of the business of government to be writing prayers." Remember that phrase when someone proposes prayer at city council meetings or a national day of prayer. Is this the business of government? It is no part of the business of government to be composing prayers. From this remarkable era, Vashti McCullum, Roy Torcaso, Madeline Murray, and my parents, Edward and Sidney, have all died. Steve Engel is elderly. I'm just about the only living person who knew all of them. Pennsylvania has had more than its fair share of important court cases. The Abington case, the Lemon case, it has the three-pronged test of whether something passes constitutional muster. the Allegheny County case about a nativity scene, and then the wonderful decision in Dover, Pennsylvania, about intelligent design. The reason that Pennsylvania seems to stand out is because Pennsylvania consists of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, with Alabama in between. We received about 5,000 letters, roughly one-third supporting us, one-third opposing in what may I say as reasonable terms, and one-third that were simply hateful and vituperative. My parents answered every letter with a return address. This was in the days before Xerox machines, and when stamps cost 3.5 cents. Still came to hundreds of dollars. We were accused immediately of being everything the writer hated. Well, you expect these. What are you, commies? What are you, Nazis? What are you Catholics? What are you, Jews? Okay. We didn't expect the ones that said, what are you, Presbyterians? And then, of course, there were the amusing ones that said, in the name of Christ, go to hell. But some were newspaper pictures smeared with excrement. I don't recall any letter that accusingly asked, what are you, Zoroastrians? I conclude that nobody hates Zoroastrians, and you might want to look into it. One of the things we learned was that in the United States it was considered bad not to be Christian, of course. It was very bad to be a communist. But it was really quite awful to be an atheist. When people called us, you communist atheists, they had reached their ultimate in outrage. Atheists are the most hated and feared group in America. Fear and hate often go hand in hand. For myself, I always thought that there was ever a time that prayer was surely needed, it was when getting a driver's license or entering a shopping mall. But I wish here to honor Madeleine Murray O'Hair, who became more famous. Her case started in Baltimore in 1960 and wound its way up through the Maryland courts. It happened that her case and ours reached the Supreme Court at the same time. Madeleine Murray, her son Garth, and adopted daughter were brutally murdered in 1996. The First Amendment is clear. There shall be no intertwining of government and religion, but you can have all the personal beliefs you want. You can believe in psychics, magnetic bracelets, in Zeus or Jupiter, in Venus or Aphrodite, in fairies and pixies, praying and rituals, all to your heart's content. But you have no right to get any government to help you impose your views on the rest of us. Now, I oppose the view that praying and searching for spiritual peace or healing is a satisfactory substitute for learning about difficult issues in the world and struggling with them. I think our struggle is not to find inner peace, but to keep alive the itch that makes us want to do better. As the poet John Donne observed, there is peace in the grave, but none, I think, do there embrace. Public prayer is not intended to promote religious values, but to enhance the authority of some churches and some political views over others. Similarly with the posting of the Ten Commandments. It is about power, not about religion. And the Constitution clearly intends that there should be freedom from religion. Government is to be free from religious interference, and this is clear because the Constitution makes no provision for any church or religion to have any official role. Our Constitution and our government do not depend on any divine blessing. We got many letters about what I call the missionary position. Many people who protested the Supreme Court's decision said, well, if it weren't for the prayers in the schools, many kids would never hear about Christ or God. What an absurd idea. But so what? What is the source of this notion that everyone has to be introduced to Christ or to Allah in order that their souls might be saved? I think if believers are happy with their souls, why not leave mine alone? The right to privacy, to be left alone by government and police, is an important constitutional liberty. The school attorneys argued at length that the Bible reading was vital to instilling moral values. They even went so far with this as to claim the Bible was not a religious book. But what about these moral values? I note that when Catholics and Protestants talk about morality, they actually mean just sex. But no writer in biblical times had the slightest clue about sperm or ova or genetics. Did you know that the human egg was only discovered in 1827? And after all, it is largely religious dogma that opposes gay marriage and rights of women. It was religious dogma that made contraception illegal. It is religious dogma that promotes circumcision and genital mutilation. It is religious dogma that promotes abstinence and categorizes masturbation as sin. It was religious dogma 100 years ago that insisted women were morally unfit to vote. and it is religious doctrine that aims to discredit evolution and insert intelligent design or creationism in the schools in place of sound science. And the 10 Commandments? The first 6 are about a God belief and have no moral or ethical content whatsoever. I do not see the 10 Commandments as showing the slightest concern for children or family values, nor for freedom of conscience. Our laws are clearly based on economic capitalism and humanistic values. Is there anyone who thinks our tax laws and Medicare laws are based on any commandments? You might actually be amused to know that there are actually 613 commandments in Jewish scriptures, all filled with thou shalt nots. I'm not entirely hostile to religion. I am hostile to what Dan Dennett calls in his book, Breaking the Spell, toxic religions. That is, those that demean the human experience and demean the joys of being alive. We all know that early childhood conditionings make us disposed to some traditions that we like. I am an atheist. I'm also a member of a Unitarian Universalist church, and I love Christmas trees. There is a place for some rituals, a place for celebration of the beauty and intelligence and love and passions that we all share. And incidentally, the Christmas tree was first introduced to America in 1846 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, by Carl Follen, a Unitarian. Religion by rote does not promote spiritual values, nor does constant repetition of the pledge promote patriotic or civic values. Public prayer is not intended to promote religious values, but to enhance the authority of some churches and some political views over others. As I said before, it is about power, not about religion. I note that almost everyone is an atheist. Christians are atheists with regard to Zeus and Woden. Muslims are atheists with regard to the Egyptian sun god Ra. Jews, Christians, and Muslims are atheists with regard to the Hindu god Shiva. And so it goes. Modern-day atheists, of course, merely believe in one fewer god than you do. Monotheism has not produced any observable benefits. In the old days, if the rain god or crop god or fertility god didn't do right, you knew exactly who to complain to. Now you have to complain about the whole universe, from global warming to bank bailouts to acorn community organizing, really to get your foot in the door. There is, of course, a very good case for polytheism. If you have 365 gods, every day is a holiday. In our Constitution, the word in the First Amendment is religion. No law respecting an establishment of religion. The phrase is not a religion, but religious doctrines or dogmas in general, which are prohibited from being established by governments. This is an important distinction. Non-establishment is broader than merely one church or ecclesiastical organization. The founders were thoughtful men, and they did not choose the word religion over church without careful thought as to its meaning. Madison noted that throughout history, superstition, bigotry, and persecution have accompanied the union of religion and government. He also noted that Christianity did not need the support of government to flourish. This is an important point to remember when somebody shouts about original intent. Owing to Tom Paine and the general intellectual movement of the times, the Enlightenment, and distaste for the existing systems, the founders reached back to ancient Greece, a pagan civilization, for inspiration about democracy and a government based on the common man. Having discarded the divine right notion, they had no intention of allowing a new set of religious doctrines to take over. The divine right of kings, you may have read about in history class. It was a notion that prevailed from the earliest days of Christianity and arose from earlier pagan philosophy that rulers, by virtue of their being rulers, were obviously favored by the gods. This divine right notion not only gave kings legitimacy in the eyes of the church, but allowed that whatever religion the king had, everybody else had to have too. The kings loved the idea, of course. But almost all the language in the Declaration of Independence is to refute church authority in rulership. This is where we see inalienable rights granted by the Creator to ordinary humans, disputing the supposed superiority of the kingship class that had been supported by the church. The Declaration of Independence is equally for independence in both government and in religion. It had to be so. Divorcing the king meant divorcing the king's religious authority. The Declaration of Independence was not based on the Bible or commandments. In fact, it was in direct opposition to churches and religious hierarchies. There's not a single phrase in the Bible that offers a model for the Declaration of Independence. For the colonies to declare independence in direct violation of the king was indeed a radical step. The divine right notion was deeply embedded in everybody's mind, in priestly leadership, and in political thinking before this time. The authors of the Declaration, mostly Thomas Jefferson, needed poetic language and appeals to emotion to overcome the divine right mindset, and to reject the notion that we needed a blessing from the Almighty in order to prosper. One of the most brilliant ideas of the founders, probably James Madison, was the idea of an independent judicial branch. This, too, was a radical departure from the European systems the founders were aware of. Under the divine right notion and the hegemony of the church, there were actually two different court systems, normal civil and criminal courts under the king, but also church courts. Church courts dealt with cases of heresy and blasphemy, as well as clergy conduct. There were no checks and balances on these courts at all. Oddly enough, this issue was revisited just a few years ago when the Catholic Church in Boston had the chutzpah to actually argued that our courts had no power over priests, that priests were to be judged only by the court's canon law system. This self-serving position was summarily rejected by the U.S. federal courts, a ratification that constitutional law trumps church law in the United States. People sometimes say, we are a Christian nation. We are not. We are a constitutional nation. It is, of course, entirely true that a majority of Americans self-identify with some brand of Christianity, but our Constitution, our laws, and our governments are not Christian. They are not Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist either. And look how successful separation of church and state has proven to be. The United States has more churchgoers, more denominations, and more money donated to churches than any other country in the world. All the evidence shows that the secular Constitution has been extremely good for religiousness and religiosity. Today, there are loud voices claiming that Christians are being persecuted, that their beliefs are under threat of extinction. I cannot take them seriously. When I drive down the street, almost every corner has a church with a prominently displayed cross. It is absurd to think that Christians are an endangered species. I do note that these churches always have lightning rods. This shows a lack of confidence. In fact, the Christian right are thriving and flush with political power and have huge sums of money, and they claim to speak for all Americans. But are they using this power to promote tolerance, good government policies, decent conditions for our citizens? Sadly, often not. They are exercised about posting the Ten Commandments, having more public prayer, getting tax money for religious schools, denying gays the right to marry, prohibiting abortion, and insisting on keeping under God in the pledge. Unfortunately, pandering to public piety has always appealed to politicians. I oppose this politically motivated God talk. Many of our fellow Americans seem to feel vague fears and seek refuge in the supernatural for a naive sense of security by their displays of religiosity. The role of separation of church and state is all the more important. For it does government no good to rely on magical thinking, and it does religion no good to be separated from reality. There are many dimensions to these fears. There is a huge amount of belief in psychics, astrology, alien abductions, faith healing, appearances of the Virgin Mary, even on cheese sandwiches, stone statues that burst into tears, and exorcism, ghosts, prayers, demons, life after death, crop circles, raptures, creationism, magnetic bracelets, homeopathy, all stuff related to magical thinking and supernaturalism. The list of irrational nonsense is endless. We used to call this superstition. We are in an age of belief in silly things. Many are relatively harmless, but it is a sign of an unhealthiness in our society, and this, I think, is related to fear. Apparently, for many, the world does not make sense, and is thus a bit unknown, or even worse, unknowable. That makes people want to cling naively to all sorts of weird notions that give them emotional comfort and seem to make sense. The teabaggers are a perfect example. My plea is to use the power of our rational minds to understand the world. And for some reason, televangelists are unwilling to share God's email address with the rest of us. Doesn't sound like Christian charity to me. I mean, for people who claim to talk to God every day via telepathy or satellite, I have to put up with Comcast. But I do know that one-way tickets to heaven are frightfully expensive. There are better bargains on the internet. Well, I think that secular students are ascending. The respected Pew organization shows that over the last decade, the number of Americans describing themselves as non-believers, agnostics, or even atheists has risen dramatically, especially in the under 30 age group. The polls show that something like 14 to 18% of the population now consider themselves non-believers. It is the most rapidly growing segment. That is, 15% doesn't sound like much, but when you consider that means that there are 45 or 50 million Americans, more than the membership of most denominations. Among freshman college students at Tufts and Harvard, now almost 33% put down for their religious preference none. This was unthinkable 10 years ago. It is refreshing to hear our president now refer to Christians, Jews, Muslims, and non-believers. But it is still disturbing that even now, some 85% of Americans say they would never consider voting for an atheist. From a democracy viewpoint, religious officials and promoters are not elected, they take no oath of office for the Constitution, and do not even have to account for their money. Religious leaders, of course, have always tried to capture the power of government to promote their self-interests and agendas. But I am confident. I think we, the people, is a beautiful and an enduring idea. There is a viewpoint. No man or men can save this nation. It's time to put our trust in God or we perish. Or in another form, do we believe in the rule of God's law or the rule of man? This drivel is carefully intended to hide that some other men want to take control and claim that they know God and nobody else does. It's very appealing to priests and popes and preachers desiring to have more power. So I end with these thoughts. The Constitution was made for we the people, not for deities. It is up to us humans to cherish and defend it. Various gods can fend for themselves quite well without any help from hairless apes. I am a strong supporter of separation of church and state. I think public displays of piety for political gains does an evil purpose in public and demeans religious values. I think our loyalty and our patriotism is to our Constitution. And we have to recognize what we're up against. Televangelists bring in $350 million a year, and churches bring in several billion dollars. Consider the National Center for Science Education. It gets by every year doing wonderfully good work on a budget of only $900,000. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has about 14,000 members. The American Humanist Association recently broke 10,000 members. The entire Unitarian Universalist movement is only 400,000. So there's a lot in front of us. But I think that secularism is beautiful and moral and ethical and exciting and fun. We all know beauty in our own lives. When we expand this, we recognize a wider beauty. The love we have known in our own lives expanded as a wider love and understanding. I have seen remote uplands in mountains and in physics, and I recall this poetry inspired from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I have walked upon uplands unbounded, and know that we, who arrived unbidden, may have consort with things eternal. Our secular uplands embrace music and science and beauty and caringness beyond the farthest horizons of scriptural literalists and fundamentalists. I am grateful for the role that many traditions have played in my life, and the Freethought encouraged me to have this role in history. And I pass the torch to you. You are where the future is. You are the advancing edge of the 15% of us who are admitted non-believers. We secularists are no longer a fringe, and as a bloc, we do count. Our next frontier is to be recognized as a voting bloc. At 15%, we make the margin of difference in most elections. I know that SSA is not a political organization, and some of you might even be Republicans, to which all I can say is that nobody is perfect. My point is that we all agree that we do not need more God talk or more God bless talk from our politicians. I mean, if candidates pander to the evangelicals, it is past time for them to pander a bit to us secular humanists. We need to let them know loud and clear by calling their offices and writing that we don't like it and we vote. And watch for the false quotes coming from the attributed to our founding fathers. There's a nutcase named Barton who's running around who has a full-time business making up false quotes about the religious beliefs of the founding fathers. It's time that we put a stop to this. And when you graduate and go out into the working world, keep the faith. Join up with humanists. Join Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Secular Coalition, American Atheists, and other groups, and that keep the torch burning. And I hope you know all about the new websites of the Coalition of Reason, intended to be a resource for all of us in the secular movement. So I say, hooray for secular students. And then finally I'll say, you know, the Bill of Rights guarantees several freedoms. Freedom of speech, religion, rights to a fair trial, etc. It does not guarantee freedom from long-winded speakers. This was an oversight of the founding fathers. Thank you.